Great to see everyone again tonight. We're thankful that you are with us for our time of worship and appreciate those who are our guests for being with us tonight. More than one of our fine men came to me on the way out the door this morning or on the way in the door this evening and said to me, "Thank you for helping me out with my Valentine's gifts today." And I'm not going to call their names and tell you who they are, but I'm sure they'll be on our injured sick list by next Sunday if they in fact do what they're claiming they're going to do. Well, we're in the book of Exodus. We're in chapter 1. We're going to finish chapter 1 tonight. And by the time we come to Exodus chapter 1, the last part of chapter 1, the children of Israel have been in Egyptian bondage. They've been in captivity for hundreds of years by now. And you can just imagine in your own thought process, because they are humans like we are, they were beginning to wonder, why in the world is this happening to us? Why did God bring us to this place? Why did God allow us to be taken into captivity? Why is God allowing us to be punished and to have to work so hard and be like slaves? What is God's purpose for all of this? Now, we do not have, or we have some advantages that they do not have. We have the advantage of looking back through the eyes of the Holy Spirit, through the eyes of Moses, what Moses wrote some thousands of years ago. We have the benefit of his divine explanation of God's sovereign and providential plans. And I believe that those are two key words that we're going to be talking about tonight, God's sovereignty and God's providence. We not only have the hindsight of seeing it as we're in the end of the story, but we have the words that describe for us God's unfolding purpose. And remember, what we said about the book of Exodus is it is a part of God's larger plan. It is a part of God's eternal plan to bring about redemption. And he uses a redemptive story about his people in the Old Testament, not only to bring about, but to explain to us the redemptive story that we read when it comes to the life of Jesus Christ and his death and burial and resurrection. Now, even as Moses tells the story, God is revealing for us something about his purposes. And the people of God, just like today, don't always know what is going on as God is unfolding his purpose. You can't always know what God is up to. You can't always tell what he is doing. And that's key for us as we try to figure out in our own lives what is going on. What is God's purpose? What is going on with God's providence? Because part of providence is that we trust in him even when the lights are out. We trust him when we can't see the future. That we trust him when we don't know what is going to happen next. And the people of God had to learn in Exodus, as Job had to learn, just as we have to learn. Now, we come to Exodus chapter 1, verse 15, and it's one of those instances in which the lights seemingly go out. But what we're going to learn is that God is sovereign. The last time we were together, we talked about verses 8 through 14 of Exodus chapter 1. And we said that Pharaoh, in an attempt to retain his power and to keep the children of Israel kind of under his control, who were multiplying, tried to figure out a plan that he might slow that growth down. I believe that ultimately, and we'll see tonight, that it wasn't Pharaoh's idea just to slow the growth down, but he wanted to eradicate the entire nation of Israel. Not just keep them small, but he wanted to do away with them. And we're going to see that in our text for tonight. And so he had this plan. He decided that he would make them work harder. That he would place a harder burden on them. So he enforced on them heavy, burdensome labors. He forced a type of corporate labor on the men, building cities, making bricks, working in the fields around the Nile, doing manual labor, even that you might say animals would have expected to do in these types of settings. But we also saw that it did not work, because even in the midst of Pharaoh's hard heart and his plan to thwart the growth of the people of God, God blesses them in accordance with the blessing and the promise that he had given to Abraham. Remember, God had said to Abraham, your people are going to be numberless. They're going to be like the sands of the seashore and the stars in the heaven. And so Pharaoh is trying to slow the growth down, but even while he's doing that, we read in the middle part of chapter 1 that the people are growing. And so when we come to this passage tonight, Pharaoh is now changing his scheme. He's changing his plans. It's like plan A didn't work, I'm going to drop back to plan B. Sometimes the first plan doesn't work, so we'll try a new plan. And so here comes plan B. It's a second plan to control, to suppress, and again, I believe to eradicate the children of Israel. I want us to understand what's going on here tonight. Moses is making it even more clear in this passage that what we have going on is not just a contest of a powerful Near Eastern monarch and the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not just the story of a king who is seeking to kind of consolidate his control over a nation, to make his nation invulnerable to attack, and to use these people that are already in proximity to accomplish that. It is, in fact, an ongoing battle, a war that has greater dimensions even than this. There are cosmic dimensions in this war. Because in this story, it's not just a struggle between a king and a nation, but it is a struggle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And ultimately, it's the story of the struggle that Satan is attempting to thwart the purposes of God. Now, don't make any doubt about it. What is going on here in the big scheme of things is that Satan is using this new ruler, this new monarch, this new Pharaoh, this new king. He is using him as a pawn to try to end God's ultimate plan. I believe the serpent understood the plan of God. He understood it because if you go back to Genesis 3 verse 15, in the Garden of Eden, the first time he appears, do you remember what was said to him? It was said to him that the seed of the woman, that he might bruise the heel of the seed of the woman, but that the seed of the woman would bruise his head. And Satan understood that. He knew that there was a cosmic warfare going on. He knew that he was engaged in the battle. And he's going to do everything he can, even beginning early on with people like Noah and Abraham and Moses and others. And now the children of Israel, he is going to use them to try to defeat God's eternal plan. And he will do that throughout the law, and he'll do that throughout the prophets. And then when Jesus comes into the world, when Jesus is born, what in the world is going on? Well, we'll see something similar to what was going on then. And so Pharaoh's, there are two or three things I want to look at tonight, and we won't spend a lot of time on any of these. But number one, we're going to see Pharaoh's second plan to control the children of Israel. If you look with me at verses 15 and 16, you see kind of delineated the second phase of Pharaoh's plan to keep the children of Israel under control. Or I believe rather more boldly to destroy the children of Israel. So look at the words. Then, it's almost like he has said in verses 13 and 14, he concocted this idea of making them work harder. Seems like that didn't work because they grew. But then verse 15 says, the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whose name was Shiphrah, and the other whose name was Puah. And he said to them, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. Well, what in the world is that all about? What in the world is going on here? I believe that it's not just that he wants to slow the growth down, but he wants to destroy the people. Let me pause here, and you may say, wait a minute. Doesn't he need their forced labor? Doesn't he need them to do his work? He would like, I believe more, it was like he would like maybe a half Israelite and a half Egyptian to be his forced laborers. He wanted laborers, but he didn't want all of the Israelites only, because he was afraid of them. We've already pointed out. And so his desire is really to destroy Israel. And I believe that he chose at this occasion to destroy Israel by killing all of the male babies, to wipe out all of the men in order to bring about the only progress in the race through intermarriage in Egypt. So Pharaoh's plan is in direct cross purposes with God's plan. And the question is, who's going to win? Moses tells you Pharaoh is here. Already in verses 15 and 16, we see the part of the cosmic struggle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And what we see here is Pharaoh's attempt to retain his own power and to destroy the people of Israel. And so he commands these midwives to commit infanticide, to murder the infants, specifically the murder of the infant boys. And in doing so, he again, I believe, is merely a pawn of Satan. Now, maybe he has his own reasons for doing this. Maybe if you and I had been there, we might have heard something about a greater humanitarian explanation. There's a limited food supply. We have a lot of people to take care of, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, they might say what we're doing is much more humane than the countries around us. But ultimately, what I want us to see is that Pharaoh is the pawn of Satan. Whether knowingly or unknowingly, he is carrying out the design of the evil one. Now, it's interesting that we say here that maybe he might claim some greater humanitarian reason. And we hear that all the time in our world today. We hear it when we talk about, for instance, we talk about abortion. There are always people who can give you what they believe to be a greater humanitarian reason. There's a good reason for this to occur. And Moses is depicting this idea, and he's unfolding a drama before us, this contest between the God of Israel and the God of Egypt. And Pharaoh, of course, is one of the gods of Egypt. They believe that Pharaoh was divine. And so we're going to see now who is sovereign. The God of Egypt, the little g false gods, Pharaoh, the other little g false gods of Egypt, whom the Egyptians worship, or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is a battle, a war between the forces of light and darkness that Moses is unfolding for us. So look at some of the details in verses 15 and 16. I want you to notice, first of all, the irony that fills this passage. And these ironies are not only display God's wisdom, but they display for us God's sovereignty. For instance, think of this. Egypt's fear of Israel leads Egypt to wickedness with the design of destroying Israel. But it fails. Because of their fear, they want to destroy Israel. The midwives' fear of God leads to a refusal to do the wickedness that they're commanded to do, and God's plan succeeds. There's irony throughout this passage, just like that. The king of Egypt having a conversation, an interview, if you will, a court session with two midwives. Now, I know we live in a different time, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but for the king of Egypt to have a conversation with midwives in that day and age, to share a courtroom with women, was beneath the majesty, the mightiest monarch on the face of the earth at that time. Look how far the God of Egypt has to go to plan his desires. He's dependent upon two, can we say, lowly midwives to fulfill his plan. Notice also in this text that the names of the midwives are mentioned. Shiphrah and Puah. Now, perhaps one of these, we're told by some scholars that one name means beautiful, and the other name means a favored one. Isn't it interesting that in this text we have the names of these two ladies, but we don't have the name of the leading monarch in the entire world? His name isn't mentioned anywhere. None of the king's names are mentioned. None of the Pharaoh's names are mentioned. They're forgotten, but the names of the righteous will live forever. And God uses these two faithful women to fulfill His ongoing plan, His scheme of redemption, to bring about salvation to the entire world. And their refusal to bow down to this horrible plan of this tyrant is an integral component to God's fulfillment, the line of promise, succession, even in the bondage of Egypt, so that the Messiah, the Son of God, would enter the world born in Israel. In the biblical scale of values, these lowly champions of morality assume a far greater historic importance than all of the power of the nations of the world. That tells us that God can use whomever He chooses to fulfill His plan. God can use people who may not appear to be powerful, who may not be mighty, who may not have names that are recognized by people around the world. God can use anybody to fulfill His purpose. Look at the command of Pharaoh. This is cruelty at its best. Look at this plan that shows how cruel and contemptuous the heart of this ruler is. First of all, children are to be killed. Infant children are to be killed. You can't conceive of a more wicked deed in the life of any individual. You know, of all the human beings that dwell on the planet that are the most innocent, it's the children. The defenseless children in the first moments of their birth or even prior to their birth, and people want to take those lives. And we look at Pharaoh, who wanted to take the lives of all of those who have been born just after they're born, up to the age of 2, and we say, what an animal, what a cruel thing for an individual to do. But it happens thousands of times every single day in our country. Secondly, He calls on women to carry out the murder of these little children. Now, you don't have to know everything to recognize the unnaturalness of that. Women who are the carriers of life, the givers of life, are called upon to be the destroyers of life. Did you know that in the Bible and historically, there were no doctors who delivered babies? No OBGYNs? You don't find those in the Bible or historically. You know why? Because midwives delivered babies. As a matter of fact, that was the way babies were delivered until about the 16th century universally. It was midwives. It wasn't even considered appropriate for a man to be anywhere near when the baby was being born. It was considered immodest. And so midwives were always the way that children were delivered. And He is calling upon those who are the assisters of giving life to slaughter the very ones to whom they were giving life. But that's not all. He calls upon those who are called Hebrew midwives to do this. Some scholars will try to tell you that they really might not have been Hebrew midwives, that they may have been some from another nation, and that term Hebrew can be used in other ways. But what we know is that He did something that is so ungodly. Moses is painting a picture of how dark Pharaoh's heart is. But in the bigger scheme, again, it's not the heart of Pharaoh. It is the heart of the serpent. Why would Pharaoh only want to kill the males? Well, because he knew they were the potential soldiers who could serve with some enemy of Egypt. The women could be assimilated into Egypt through intermarriage or through ethnic cleansing. The bloodlines, the status, the nationality, the ethnicity was perpetrated through the male bloodline. And so that's who He wanted to eliminate. But of course, behind all of this, again, we recognize that there's a sheer attempt to thwart the will of God. God had promised the seed of woman would crush the head of the serpent. A manifestation of Satan's designs against the church, ultimately. We find in Revelation 12, verse 4. Satan, under the old covenant, is doing everything within his power to prevent the coming of the seed of woman, the promised champion who would crush the head of the serpent. In the new covenant, after the coming of the seed of woman, the Messiah, Satan is still waging a kind of a futile, vindictive war against the church. In the wake of the coming of the promised one, Satan is using Pharaoh now to foster that purpose. Now you can imagine all manner of other implications from this passage. I think it cries out, this passage does, to remind us that church is universal, the constant historical support for the sanctity of life. Did you know that until this century, that nearly every religious organization, every religious group, every faith that claimed to be Christian recognized the validity or would not recognize any sort of the validity of abortion or infanticide? The Romans practiced both, but Christians never did. They held the Romans in contempt for it. We should not forget that today. Abortion in history has been aided and abetted oftentimes by the quietness of people of faith who say, I'm not going to say anything about it. Physician-assisted, nurse-assisted abortion in euthanasia is a contradiction to that very profession and certainly to the plan of God. Make no mistake about it, this terrible thing that Pharaoh is doing is an attempt to annihilate Israel as the people of God from the face of the earth. If you look at verses 17 through 19, we see a second thing. We see the brave faithfulness of the midwives in resisting evil, and we see the subsequent conversation that they had with Pharaoh. It's recorded here for us. I want you to notice the words. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. Now Pharaoh had called them in, and he had commanded that they take the lives of the babies as they're born. But there are two key phrases in this entire text that are vitally important to us. Number one, here is the first phrase: they feared God. The clear connotation is that they did not fear Pharaoh. They weren't afraid of him. Even though he had told them what they were supposed to do, they did not fear him. They feared God. They were in awe of God. They knew that they could not do what they had been commanded to do. They refused to do that. They feared him as the life giver, and they honored the sanctity of life at the risk of their own. And these women foiled the plan of the tyrant of Egypt. You see the irony? Two midwives. Now I know that raises some questions for some people. You mean only two midwives? How could there only be two midwives and perhaps 1 million Israelites? Only two? Well, we don't know. Probably more. One scholar suggested that they were kind of like the head of the midwives guild, that these were the main two. We don't know. But what we do know is that God's plan is greater. And that when people are faithful to God, God's plan will work. I can imagine God in heaven saying, let's see. And he laughs at Pharaoh. I'll thwart your plan with two midwives. I'll use the very instruments of your plan as the instruments of my plan, and I'll use them to ruin your plan. I am the one who is sovereign, and you are not. The irony here points to the fact that God alone is sovereign. Two midwives confound the power of Egypt. Now, during the interview, what you're going to see is that they attempt to hide the truth from Pharaoh. Yes, they lie to Pharaoh. And some commentators try to be kind about it and try to get them off the hook for this, and they say things like, well, maybe it was true what they said. it doesn't really matter what was said. We're told specifically in the passage that they determined not to do what Pharaoh had asked them to do. And then when he asked them why, it was that they didn't do what he commanded them to do. They say, well, they didn't say, well, we just decided not to do it. They say there's other explanations for it. So they're deliberately attempting to hide the truth. They lie to him. Can you see the irony even in the story they concocted? You see what they said? Look at verse 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. Do you see what they're saying here? There's irony even in the story that they use. They are saying the Egyptian women are wimpy. The Hebrew women are real women. They're strong and powerful, and we can't even get to them in time. And they just pop those babies out before we can get to them. And so Moses manages insult to insult all the Egyptians, even in the answer of the Hebrew midwives. By the way, if you go back to verse 17, where it says the midwives feared God, it's the first time the name of God is mentioned in the book of Exodus. His sovereign hand is found throughout the book. It's found everywhere, in every verse, every step of the way. But isn't it interesting that Moses kind of holds his name until this phrase is used, that they feared God? Why? Because one of the great themes of Exodus is, who are you going to serve, God or Pharaoh? Who are you going to serve? And we have to deal with that in our lives every day. Who are you going to serve? Are you going to serve God or are you going to serve the world? Sometimes we have to deal with that when it comes to our own relationships. Are you going to serve God or are you going to serve people who are above you? Sometimes even with our own government, are you going to serve God or are you going to serve the government? Who are you going to serve? Who do you fear, God or Pharaoh? Who is sovereign, God or Pharaoh? And the fear of God is the phrase in which God's name is mentioned. And we're called upon to do the same thing. And I've often wondered when in this culture, when we're asked to do what God commands us not to do, whether our faithfulness will be used to further the cause of God and bring glory to His name. What if it happened here in our country? What if we were told, you can no longer worship God as a gathered body of people? You know there are countries where that happens now. They can't gather together to worship God. What would we do? Would we fall to the voices of the world, or would we stand with God and say we're going to do what is right? When either by enticement or by order, our culture commands us to do what is against God's word, do you think about the fact that we are part of the greater struggle? It's not just us versus somebody else, but we're a part of this cosmic warfare, and perhaps in God's providence, He can use you. Perhaps young people, in God's providence, He can use you to be the person who says, I'm going to do what's right when everybody else does wrong. Perhaps He has chosen that your faithfulness will be used to preserve His people. And the last thing I want to notice tonight very quickly is that God blesses those who fear Him and He judges those who do not. Look at verses 20 through 22. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Two key phrases I said. Number one, they feared God. Number two, God was good to them. You see, when you fear God and you obey Him, God is going to be good to you. I think one of the major themes in the Old Testament, from Genesis through the end of the Old Testament, is this: that when we serve God and when we fear God and when we obey God, that God blesses us. God blesses people who obey Him. And then He says, because the midwives feared God, He established households for them. You get a glorious report of God's favor on these midwives. You see that God pours out His blessing on those who fear Him. He reports that on these midwives, not a blessing for their lying, but a blessing for their courage in refusing to do what was wrong, that God was good to them. You see, verse 21 says God established households for the midwives. I don't know all of the significance of that. I read one commentator who suggested that a lot of times that barren women were used as midwives. And so we're told here, it may be that Moses is telling us that though these women were in this profession because they themselves had not been able to bear children, that God blessed them with children, that God rewarded their faithfulness. You remember God told David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, "You will not build a house for me, but I will build a house for you." You see, if you obey me, I will bless you. Think again about the irony here. Pharaoh tells the midwives to destroy households. They refuse and save households, and God gives them households instead. Again, the irony is that Pharaoh's plans are thwarted, and you would expect in their thwarting of Pharaoh's plans for his judgment to prevail in this experience. But in fact, as they thwart Pharaoh's plans, they are greeted by the blessing of God. And every time you say no to Satan and yes to God, God is going to bless you. God is going to look after you. God is going to care for you. And sometimes it may not always be the exact blessing that we want. Sometimes we may not see physical blessings in this life, but ultimately in eternity we will be blessed. Now Pharaoh, in the end, turns his plans into a wide open plan. It's like he's saying, well, if these midwives won't do this, then I'll get someone else. And look at verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive." All of the people of Egypt are now to be engaged in the extermination of the Israelite males. Pharaoh's casting on this plan of mass murder to be accomplished in drowning to everyone. All of the people of Egypt are to be involved. A lot of you will remember Cecil B. DeMille's version of the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston as Moses. He makes a great Moses, doesn't he? What a great choice. Not a bad Moses at all for a Gentile. Perhaps you'll remember that one of the liberties that DeMille takes, one of the liberties, is he makes the announcement of Pharaoh's intention to kill the male children of Israel to come immediately after the announcement of the 10th and final plague. And you might remember that moment where the daughter of Pharaoh, which, by the way, this is not recorded in Scripture, but it's inserted in the film, is having a final meeting, which, according to Cecil B. DeMille, a final meeting with Moses, who is her old flame. And she says, "Come, Moses, my chariot is waiting. I will save you." And Moses says, "Save me from what?" "Well, Moses, don't you know that Pharaoh has ordered that all the firstborn sons of Israel must die?" And Charlton Heston replies as Moses replies, "He has written his own sentence by his own hand." And he cries out for the mercy of God. There's a whole lot of liberty in that. That wasn't exactly the way it occurred, especially the part about she believing that he was her old flame. But here's the part that is exactly correct. Pharaoh is writing his own sentence. And as he has ordered all the males of Israel to be drowned in the waters of the Nile River, so the whole army of Egypt is going to be drowned in the waters of the Red Sea. In the very next passage, the Savior of Israel, Moses, rather than being drowned in the waters of the Nile River, will be saved by Pharaoh's daughter. How does all of that happen? It happens because God is sovereign. It happens because God's purposes will not be defeated. And listen, it doesn't matter what happens in a nation, a country, by government, by any group of people in the world, God will not allow his purposes to be defeated because God is sovereign. And Moses will be saved by Pharaoh's daughter. And so fear him, church. Trust him. Put your faith and your confidence in him. He will not let you down. And his purposes will not be thwarted by any power known to man. And so next time we're together, we're going to see this little baby who is born and who is placed in the Nile River, not to be killed, but to be saved. And the rescuer himself is going to be rescued. I hope you'll keep studying with us. If you're not a Christian tonight, the most important thing you can do with your life is to give it to Jesus Christ. If you believe that he's the Son of God, if you'll give him your life in repentance, if you'll confess his name before men and be buried with him in baptism, he'll make you his child. He'll do that tonight. And if you're a Christian, my plea for all of us tonight is that we'll never forget that God's purposes will not be thwarted, and that we will be faithful to him even when we're coerced or commanded not to be. If we can pray for you, if we can help you in any way, we invite you to come while we stand together and while we sing this song.